Welcome to Turning Points, the place where one single moment can change or destroy an entire life. Tonight, we go back to a sweltering day in 1836 on a Mississippi River wharf. A chained 14-year-old girl steps off a steamboat. In the space of one heartbeat, the crowd falls silent, grown men forget to breathe, and every future in her world pivots on the single fact that she is the most beautiful human being any of them have ever seen. That heartbeat became a turning point. It bought her silk dresses and a bedroom in the big house. It gave her a master who called her his wife behind closed doors, and it sentenced her to give birth to 7 children she would bury, one by one, with her own hands before she turned 30. This is the true story of Zeldina, one woman, 7 tiny graves, and the cruelest turning point American slavery ever wrote. If you're ready to witness a life that changed forever in a single glance, keep watching. And please, drop a quick comment right now telling me which country you're watching from and what time it is there for you. Then hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a turning point. Let's step into the moment everything changed. In the sweltering summer of 1836, the Natchez under the hill landing reeked of tar, horse sweat, and the Mississippi River's slow rot. The steamboat Delta Queen had just tied up after a 12-day run from New Orleans, and the usual crowd of speculators, cotton factors, and river gamblers pressed forward like wolves scenting blood. Slaves were being marched off the lower deck in coffles of 10, iron collars clanking, ankles raw from chains that had rubbed skin down to glistening muscle. Most kept their eyes on the ground, the way you learn to do when every white gaze feels like a hand reaching for your throat. But one girl, no more than 14 or 15, walked as if the chains were an afterthought. She stepped onto the plank with her chin lifted, shoulders back, and the entire wharf fell into a hush so sudden that even the gulls seemed to stop screaming. Her name, according to the bill of sale clutched in the trader's fist, was Zeldina. Just that. No surname, because slaves did not have surnames unless a master felt generous. She had been born on a small sugar plantation outside Opelousas, Louisiana, the daughter of a woman called Big Marie, who was half Congolese and half Choctaw, and a father no one ever spoke of, probably a white overseer who vanished the moment the pregnancy showed. From her mother, she inherited height and long limbs. From somewhere else she had inherited a face that made grown men forget what they were saying mid-sentence. Her skin was the color of river clay color that southern whites called bright mulatto, warm and even, without a single scar from the whip yet. Her hair fell in thick waves past her waist, black but shot through with threads of red where the sun struck it, the kind of hair that made women in the big house reach for their curling papers and macassar oil in envy. Her eyes were the real weapon, though, large, slightly up-tilted, the color of strong coffee with a drop of fresh cream, framed by lashes so long they cast shadows on her cheeks. When she turned those eyes on the crowd, it was not with defiance exactly, more like a calm, ancient curiosity, as if she were measuring every soul on the dock and finding them wanting. The trader, a thin, pockmarked man named Josiah Barrett, who smelled of whiskey and pomade, knew he had something extraordinary the moment he laid eyes on her back in New Orleans. He had paid $800 for her, twice the going rate for a field hand her age, and considered it the bargain of the decade. He had scrubbed her with lye soap himself, combed out her hair with bear grease until it gleamed, and dressed her in a clean but threadbare Osnaburg dress that clung to her frame like a second skin because it was 2 sizes too small. He wanted every man on the Natchez wharf to see exactly what he was offering. And they saw. Oh, they saw. The bidding started before Barrett even finished reading the inventory sheet. Voices shot up from 1,000 to 1,500 in the space of 30 seconds. A fat cotton planter from Adams County waved his hat and screamed 1,800 like he was afraid someone would cut his throat if he didn't get her. A New Orleans dandy in a dove-gray coat offered 2,000, and promised to make her his housekeeper with privileges. Someone else shouted 2,200. The numbers climbed so fast Barrett's clock could barely scratch them down. Men who had come to buy field hands suddenly discovered they needed a fancy maid. Men who already owned fancy maids decided they needed a prettier one. The riverfront became a feeding frenzy. Standing on the rough pine auction block that had been dragged out onto the levee, Zeldina listened to the numbers rise like she was listening to rain on a tin roof, something happening far away that could not quite touch her yet. She kept her gaze level, moving slowly across the faces, memorizing them the way a deer memorizes every twig that snapped in the woods. When a man in a beaver hat reached out to pinch her arm, testing the flesh the way you test a melon, she did not flinch. She simply shifted her weight so his fingers slid off, a movement so smooth it looked accidental. The man flushed crimson and bid another $100 out of pure humiliation. At $26.50 the bidding slowed. Only 2 men remained. One was a Creole sugar planter from Baton Rouge, with a face like a dissolute angel and a reputation for wearing out girls in under a year. The other was Francois Leclerc, 42 years old, widower, owner of Belle Rive Plantation 20 miles north of Natchez, a man whose name carried weight along the river because his cotton routinely graded strict middling or better, and because he paid his debts on time. Leclerc had not planned to buy anyone that day. He already owned 180 slaves and a housekeeper named Celeste, who had warmed his bed for 8 years. But the moment he saw Zeldina, something ancient and predatory woke up inside him. He recognized the same thing every other man on the levee recognized. Here was a creature who could make you forget you were going to die one day. Leclerc lifted one gloved hand, almost lazily. $3,000, he said, voice soft but carrying like a church bell. The Creole opened his mouth, closed it again, and stepped back. No one in Mississippi or Louisiana crossed Francois Leclerc when he spoke in that particular tone. Barrett's gavel fell so hard it cracked. "Sold to Monsieur Leclerc of Belle Rive for the unprecedented sum of $3,000, he crowed, half delirious with his own profit. The crowd erupted in whistles and coarse laughter. Someone shouted, "Better lock her up good, Leclerc, or half the county'll be sneaking in your back door." Through it all, Zeldina never dropped her gaze. When Leclerc stepped forward to claim his property, she looked straight into his pale blue eyes, eyes that had valued human beings by the pound for 2 decades, and something passed between them neither would ever be able to name. Not love, not yet, not even desire exactly. Recognition, maybe. 2 people who understood on some bone-deep level that the world had just tilted on its axis and nothing would ever stand upright again. Leclerc did not put her in the coffle with the others he had purchased that day, 6 field hands and a blacksmith. Instead, he had a separate wagon brought round, a light phaeton with red wheels, and he handed her up into it himself as though she were a white lady. The crowd hooted louder. Zeldina sat very straight on the leather seat, hands folded in her lap, staring ahead while the wagon rolled up the steep bluff toward the Silver Street stairs, and then out onto the Natchez Trace Road. Behind her, the river kept sliding south, thick and brown and patient, carrying cotton bales and broken dreams in equal measure. No one on the levee that day would ever forget the sight of her. Years later, old men who had gone grey and paunchy would still speak of the girl on the auction block who stopped every heart for 10 full seconds. They remembered her the way soldiers remember the first time they smelled gunpowder, something beautiful and terrifying that branded itself onto the soul. They did not know her name was Zeldina. They did not know she could read a little, that her mother had taught her numbers by counting stars, that she sometimes dreamed in Choctaw, though she had never set foot on tribal land. They only knew she was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen offered for sale, and that Francois Leclerc had paid a king's ransom to own her. As the phaeton disappeared into the dust of the trace, Zeldina finally allowed herself one small, almost invisible motion. She pressed her linked hands against her stomach, hard, as though trying to hold something inside that was already aching to get out. Grief, maybe, rage, or simple terror at the life that had just been decided for her by men shouting numbers under a merciless sun. Whatever it was, she kept it hidden behind those calm, measuring eyes. The wagon rolled on toward Belle Rive, toward the white columns and the pecan trees and the big house where Celeste would take one look at the new girl and know her own days of favor were numbered, toward the bedroom with the mahogany four-poster and the mosquito bays that would become both prison and altar, toward the 7 small graves that waited in the future like patient ghosts. But that afternoon, beneath the burning sky, Zeldina was still only 14, still unbroken, still carrying her beauty like a blade she had not yet learned to wield. The road ahead stretched 20 miles through canebrake and cypress shadow, and every turn of the wheel took her deeper into a story that would end with her burying every child her body gave the man who owned her. $3,000, a price higher than most white men earned in 5 years of hard labor, a price that marked her, from that day forward, as something too valuable to work in the fields, too exquisite to waste, and far, far too dangerous to ever be allowed to forget she was property. The wagon wheels creaked, the horses snorted, and Zeldina, the girl who had silenced an entire riverfront just by stepping off a steamboat, began the journey toward everything that beauty would cost. Her phaeton rolled through the gates of Belle Rive just as the sun bled out across the cotton fields, turning the bowls into a sea of fire. Zeldina stepped down onto the shell drive without waiting for a hand. Her bare feet touched warm gravel for the first time in weeks, and she felt the crushed oyster shells bite like tiny teeth. The big house rose before her, 3 stories of whitewashed brick, galleries running the full length of each floor, green shutters closed against the heat. Jasmine climbed the columns in thick ropes, the scent so heavy it felt like drowning in perfume. Slaves paused in their evening tasks to stare, the cook with a pan still in her hand, the yard boy frozen halfway up the back steps, even the old gardener leaning on his hoe as though someone had struck him in the chest. No one spoke. They simply looked and looked and looked. Celeste was waiting on the gallery. She was 33, café au lait skin, proud carriage, the acknowledged queen of the house servants for 8 years. She wore a tignon of Madras plaid, tied with the precision of a crown, and her apron was starched so stiff it could have stood alone. When she saw Zeldina, her nostrils flared once, the smallest betrayal of emotion she allowed herself. Then her face settled into the cool mask. Every house slave learns early, pleasant, watchful, lethal. Leclerc climbed the steps slowly, hat in hand, sweat darkening the armpits of his linen coat. "This is Zeldina," he told Celeste, as if introducing a new piece of furniture. "She will have the blue chamber next to mine. See that she is bathed, dressed properly, and brought to the dining room at 8. Celeste inclined her head, the movement regal and icy. "Yes, master." The words were perfect. The tone said, "You will regret this." Inside, the house breathed money. Polished mahogany rails curved up the staircase like a ship's prow. Portraits of dead Leclercs glared down from the walls. Thin lips, colder eyes. A chandelier of Waterford crystal caught the last light and scattered into 1,000 shards across the checkerboard marble floor. Zeldina had never been inside a house finer than the overseer's cottage. She walked as though the floor might crack beneath her, arms held slightly away from her sides, afraid to touch anything. Celeste led her upstairs without a word. The blue chamber was at the end of the family wing, a corner room with tall windows overlooking the river. Inside were a tester bed draped in faded damask, a walnut armoire tall enough to hide 3 grown men, and a porcelain bathtub already steaming. Someone had carried the water up while they were still on the drive. 2 younger maids, wide-eyed and whispering, waited with soap, brushes and a pile of garments that made Zeldina's breath catch, chemises of lawn so fine they were almost transparent, a corset of dove-grey silk, stockings with clocks embroidered in silver thread, and 3 dresses, one peach, one jonquil, one deep indigo, cut in the latest New Orleans fashion. Celeste dismissed the maids with a flick of her wrist. When the door closed, she turned to Zeldina and spoke for the first time. "Take that rag off." The Osnaburg shift fell to the floor. Celeste's gaze travelled over the girl's body the way a butcher studies a side of beef. Slow, professional, merciless. "Lord have mercy," she muttered, almost despite herself. "He'd lost his natural mind." The bathwater was scented with orange flower. Zeldina sank into it until only her face showed, eyes closed, letting the heat loosen weeks of river grime and terror. Celeste washed her hair herself, pouring pitcher after pitcher, working almond oil through every strand until it lay across the water like black silk. When she combed it out afterward, the teeth of the ivory comb barely snagged. "Hair like this," Celeste said quietly, "will be the death of somebody. Maybe you, maybe all of us." They dressed her in the indigo gown. The fabric had been chosen well. It made her skin glow like banked coals. The corset narrowed her waist until Zeldina could span it with her own 2 hands. Celeste tied the laces with short, angry jerks. "Breathe shallow, child. That's how the white ladies do it. You practicing now." A single strand of pearls went around her throat, Leclerc's dead wife's pearls. Everyone would know that tomorrow. Celeste fastened the clasp and stepped back. For one moment her mask slipped, and something like pity flickered across her face. Then it was gone. At 8 o'clock sharp, Leclerc was waiting at the foot of the stairs in evening dress, hair pomaded, diamond stud flashing in his cravat. When Zeldina appeared at the landing, one gloved hand on the rail, he actually forgot to breathe. She descended slowly, each step measured, eyes fixed on his face. Halfway down she paused, just long enough for him to feel the full weight of what he had bought. Then she continued, and when she reached the bottom she dropped a curtsy so perfect it could have been taught at court. Leclerc offered his arm as though she were the governor's daughter. She laid her fingers on it lightly, the way Celeste had shown her in the 5 minutes before dinner. They dined alone. The long mahogany table was set for 2 at one end, silver epergnes overflowing with camellias, candlelight shivering across crystal wine glasses. The food kept coming: turtle soup, shrimp remoulade, duck with orange sauce, syllabub, tiny pastries filled with brandied peaches. Zeldina had never seen so much food in her life. She ate carefully, copying Leclerc's movements, never taking too much, never speaking unless spoken to. He watched her constantly, as though afraid she might vanish if he blinked. After the plates were cleared, he poured Madeira into 2 glasses and led her out onto the moonlit gallery. The air was thick with night-blooming cereus. Somewhere down in the quarters a banjo began to play, soft and mournful. Leclerc leaned against the rail. "Do you know why I bought you?" he asked suddenly. Zeldina considered the question the way one might consider a coiled snake. "Because you could, master," she said at last, voice low and steady. He gave a short laugh, surprised. "Yes, exactly that, because I could." He reached out and touched her cheek with the back of his fingers, a gesture almost tender. "And because no man who saw you today will ever forget it, I wanted that memory to be mine alone." That night he took her to his bedroom. The door closed with a soft click that sounded, to Zeldina, like the closing of a coffin lid. There were no chains, no violence, only the terrible gentleness of a man who believes he is being generous. He undressed her, as though unwrapping something priceless, murmuring endearments in French too rapid for her to follow. When he kissed her, his mouth tasted of wine and tobacco and absolute certainty. She lay still beneath him, eyes open, staring at the tester overhead, where cherubs danced in faded paint. She felt the weight of him, the heat, the small animal sounds he made when he finished. Then he rolled away, satisfied, and within minutes was asleep, one possessive arm thrown across her waist. Zeldina did not sleep. She listened to the house settling around her, to the tick of the ormolu clock on the mantel, to the far-off sound of a baby crying in the quarters. She thought of her mother, Big Marie, who had once told her, "Beauty is just another whip, baby, only it hurts longer." She was 14 years old, and she understood the truth of it completely. The next morning Leclerc dressed with care and rode to Natchez to brag. He stopped first at the tavern under the hill, then at the coffee house on Main Street, then at the homes of 3 separate friends. Everywhere he went he told the same story, how he had paid $3,000 for a girl so exquisite she made the famous Sally Miller look like a washerwoman, how she spoke softly, moved, even ate as though born to the big house, how he intended to keep her there, in the family wing, dressed in silks, educated even, he laughed, perhaps taught to play the pianoforte. The men listened with widening eyes and tightening jaws. By nightfall half the county knew, and the other half would know by breakfast. At Belle Rive, life rearranged itself overnight. Celeste moved her belongings to a smaller room at the back of the second floor, lips pressed so thin they disappeared. The cook began preparing French sauces no one had tasted since Leclerc's wife died. A seamstress arrived from Natchez with bolts of Lyons silk and Brussels lace. A dancing master was engaged, though for what exactly no one dared ask. Zeldina was measured, poked, prodded, exclaimed over. She stood motionless while pins pricked her skin, while women twice her age cooed about her tiny waist and perfect bosom. She learned to say "Oui, madame," and "Non, monsieur," with the soft lilt Leclerc liked. She learned to pour tea without spilling a drop, to glide rather than walk, to lower her eyes at the correct angle, submissive, but never cowed. And every night she went to Leclerc's bed. Sometimes he was drunk and clumsy, sometimes gentle and almost lover-like. Sometimes he simply wanted to look at her for hours, candle in hand, tracing the curve of shoulder, the slope of breast, the long, flawless line of thigh. He gave her gifts, a gold thimble, a coral earrings, a cashmere shawl that cost more than most slaves earned in a lifetime. He never struck her. He never needed to. Ownership was the blow, and it landed fresh every dawn. Within 3 months her belly began to round. She felt the quickening one afternoon while shelling peas on the back gallery, a flutter like bird wings trapped beneath her ribs. She pressed her palm there and felt it again, unmistakable. Terror and wonder warred inside her. When she told Leclerc that evening, he lifted her off her feet and spun her until she was dizzy, laughing like a boy. He summoned the doctor from Natchez, ordered chicken broth and oranges, forbade her to carry anything heavier than a teacup. He began calling her Ma Petite Paus in front of the other house servants, watching their faces for the flinch the words produced. The white neighbors came to call, ostensibly to see the new curtains or borrow a recipe, really to stare. Ladies in hoop skirts sipped lemonade on the gallery and tried to find a single flaw, too dark, too thin, too proud, while their husbands stood in the yard pretending to examine Leclerc's new-blooded stallion, and actually watching Zeldina through the open French doors as she arranged flowers or practiced scales on the rosewood pianoforte that had arrived from Baltimore. Gossip flew up down the river like startled birds. Leclerc's yellow gal was breeding already. He treated her better than his dead wife. He was going to bring her to the St. Louis Hotel ballroom one night and make every Creole in Louisiana swallow their tongues. Zeldina heard every whisper. She smiled when she was supposed to smile, curtsied when she was supposed to curtsy, and every night she lay in the dark and counted the months until the child would come, until there would be another human being in the world whose fate was tied to hers by blood and by law. Celeste watched it all with the patience of a cat at a mouse-hole. One afternoon, when Leclerc had ridden to Natchez again, she found Zeldina in the herb garden cutting mint. She spoke without looking up from the rosemary bed. "That baby gon' be born a slave," she said flatly. "Same as you, same as me. Don't matter how many silk dresses he buy you. Don't matter if he call you wife in the dark. Laws say the child follow the mother. You remember that when it cry its first cry." Zeldina's scissors paused mid-air. A drop of blood welled where she had nicked her finger without feeling it. She looked at Celeste for a long moment, then nodded once. Something passed between them, understanding, warning, the first thread of shared sorrow. After that, Celeste began leaving small things outside Zeldina's door, a packet of willow bark for pain, a tiny pair of knitted booties, a silver thimble engraved with the letter M that had belonged to Leclerc's wife. Acts of kindness disguised as duty, because kindness between slaves could be punished worse than theft. Autumn came, the cotton harvest, the ginning, the pressing. Leclerc grew restless with pride. He ordered a new landau so Zeldina could ride out with him when her time drew near. He spoke of taking her to New Orleans for the winter season, of buying box at the Théâtre d'Orléans. He had her portrait painted, seated in the peach silk gown, one hand resting on the swell of her belly, eyes looking straight out at the viewer with that calm, measuring gaze that had silenced the Natchez Wharf. When the painter unveiled the canvas, Leclerc stared at it for a long time, then paid him double without haggling, and still, every night, the big mahogany door closed behind them, and Zeldina lay beneath the man who owned her body, her future, her unborn child, and she learned the particular silence of a woman who has discovered that beauty is only another form of captivity, more gilded, more lonely, but captivity all the same. The child was due in April. The mockingbirds were already nesting in the pecan trees, and the air smelled of rain and distant thunder. Zeldina stood on the gallery one evening, hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick hard, as if already impatient to be free. She looked out over the quarters where lamps were being lit one by one, over the fields silvered with dew, over the river sliding past like time itself. And for one brief moment she allowed herself to imagine a world in which the child in her womb would never wear iron, would never stand on an auction block, would never learn the taste of a master's kiss. Then Leclerc's voice called from inside, soft and possessive, and the moment shattered like glass beneath a boot heel. She turned, smoothed her face into the perfect practiced smile, and went to him. Because that was what beauty bought you in 1837 Louisiana, the right to smile while your heart was being carved out one careful slice at a time. The first child came on a night when the rain fell so hard it sounded as though the sky itself were weeping. It was the 3rd of April, 1838, and the midwife, an old root woman named Tante Rose, who had been borrowed from a neighboring plantation, muttered that the storm was a bad omen. Lightning forked across the black fields and lit the bedroom in white flashes while Zeldina labored on the big four-poster that had once belonged to Leclerc's lawful white wife. The baby slid into the world just after 3 in the morning, a boy, small but perfectly formed, with his mother's mouth and his father's pale eyes. Leclerc, pacing the gallery in shirt-sleeves, burst in the moment Tante Rose announced the sex. He lifted the infant still slick with blood and laughed out loud, the sound startling the exhausted women. "Etienne," he declared, "after my father." He kissed Zeldina's damp forehead, told her she was magnificent, and carried the child downstairs to show the house servants who had been ordered to stay awake. Zeldina, half fainting, heard the cheers drift up through the floorboards and felt the first cold touch of dread. Etienne lived exactly 4 months and 19 days. He died on a humid August afternoon, while Zeldina was rocking him on the gallery. One moment he was nursing, tiny fist curled against her breast. The next his body went rigid, eyes rolling back, limbs jerking in a convulsion that would not stop. Tante Rose was summoned again, but there was nothing to be done. The baby's skin burned like fire, then turned cold as river clay. By sunset he was gone. Leclerc stood in the doorway holding his hat face grey, repeating mon Dieu, like a man who had never truly believed in God until that moment. They buried Etienne the next morning in a corner of the slave cemetery, in a coffin no longer than a boot box, wrapped in one of Zeldina's silk chemises, because there had been no time to sew proper grave clothes. Zeldina did not cry at the graveside. She stood dry-eyed while the red dirt was shoveled in, hands pressed to her empty belly, already feeling the next life stirring faintly, as though the womb refused to learn the lesson the world was teaching. Less than a year later, in March 1839, the second child was born, another boy, larger, louder, with a shock of dark curls. They named him Lucien. Leclerc swore this one would live. He sent to New Orleans for a wet nurse with milk said to be strong as mare's, ordered mosquito netting triple-layered around the cradle, forbade anyone with the slightest cough to come near the big house. For 6 months Lucien thrived. He learned to smile, to grip fingers, to crow at the sound of his father's boots on the stairs. Then came the yellow fever season. It swept up the river like a silent smoke. First the field hands began dying, then the cook's children, then Lucien. His skin turned the color of old gold, his eyes sank, his cries thinned to whimpers. He died in Zeldina's arms at dawn, the same hour he had been born. Leclerc was in Natchez settling a cotton debt. By the time he galloped home, the little body was already sewn into its shroud. They buried Lucien beside Etienne. 2 small mounds now, side by side, marked only by wooden shingles that the rain would erase within a season. Zeldina's grief was a silent, devouring thing. She stopped speaking for weeks. She moved through the big house like a ghost in silk slippers, arranging flowers that wilted the same day, playing the same 3 pieces on the pianoforte until the notes sounded like screams. Leclerc watched her waste, afraid for the first time that he might lose her too. He brought gifts, a locket with Lucien's curl inside, a bolt of lion's silk the color of moonlight, a tiny gold ring meant for a child's finger. She accepted everything with the same distant nod. At night she lay rigid beside him, staring at the tester until the painted cherubs blurred. When he reached for her, she no longer with triumph, but with something close to desperation. She submitted without protest, but her body felt borrowed, as though the real Zeldina had already followed her sons into the ground. The third pregnancy was announced in the autumn of 1840. This time Leclerc refused to let hope rise too high. He spoke of the child only in practicalities. Another son to carry the name, another mouth that would one day eat at his table if the fever spared it. The baby was a girl, born in a driving sleet storm in February 1841. They called her Marie Zelda, after Zeldina's mother and herself. She was delicate from the start, weighing scarcely 5 pounds, with translucent skin through which blue veins showed like rivers on a map. Zeldina nursed her constantly, terrified to let her out of sight. For almost 2 years Marie Zelda lived. She learned to walk holding Zeldina's finger, to say "maman" in a voice like birdsong. Then came the summer of 1842, the worst seasoning anyone could remember. Children dropped in the fields, in their mothers' arms, on the doorsteps of cabins. Marie Zelda lasted 9 days. On the last night, Zeldina carried her out to the gallery so she could breathe the cooler air, rocking and singing every lullaby she knew in French, in Choctaw, in the broken English of the quarters. The child died just as the moon cleared the pecan trees. Zeldina did not scream. She simply sat until sunrise, holding the cooling body until Celeste gently pried it away at dawn. 3 graves now. 3 small crosses that Leclerc had carved himself in a single night of drunken grief. The only time anyone ever saw him wield an axe. The 4th child arrived in the spring of 1843, twin boys, a miracle and a terror. They were born within minutes of each other, both strong, both crying lustily. Leclerc named them Philippe and Gabriel and ordered a celebration. Extra rum for the quarters, fireworks sent up from the levee, a fiddler brought from Natchez. For 4 months the big house rang with something almost like joy. Zeldina walked the galleries with a baby on each hip, singing to them in counterpoint, her face softer than it had been since the day she first arrived. Then the cholera came, swift and filthy, sweeping through the slave quarters first and leaping the invisible wall into the big house. Gabriel went first, burning with fever, then Philippe, who lingered 2 days longer, staring at his mother with eyes already filmed by death. They were buried together in one narrow coffin because there was no time to build two. Zeldina stood at the edge of the grave until the dirt covered the lid, then walked back to the house without looking left or right. That night she cut her hair to the shoulders with the sewing scissors, letting the long black ropes fall where they would. Celeste found her at dawn, sitting in the pile of hair, rocking and keening without sound. Leclerc began to avoid her eyes. He still came to her bed, but the act felt mechanical now, a duty performed in darkness. He spoke less and less of love and more of legacy, of the need for an heir who would outlive the summer fevers. He summoned doctors from New Orleans, from Mobile, even a Creole traiteur who burned herbs and muttered in patois over Zeldina's belly. Nothing helped. The fifth child, a girl born in January 1844, lived only 6 weeks. She simply failed to thrive, growing thinner each day no matter how much goat's milk or sugar water was forced between her lips. They named her Angel and buried her on a morning so cold the ground had to be thawed with bonfires. 6 graves. The 7th and last pregnancy was the hardest. Zeldina's body, once so resilient, now betrayed her at every turn. Her ankles swelled until she could barely walk. Her back ached constantly. Leclerc hovered, half terrified, half obsessed. He moved her bed into the parlor so she would not have to climb stairs, sat with her every evening reading aloud from French novels, as though the sound of his voice could keep death at bay. The child, another boy, was born in October 1844, small but fierce, with a tuft of reddish hair that made Leclerc laugh through tears. They named him Antoine, after Leclerc's grandfather who had founded Bellerive. For 3 months Antoine seemed to defy the curse. He gained weight, he smiled, he gripped fingers with surprising strength. Zeldina began to hope, a dangerous, fragile thing she had almost forgotten how to feel. Then came December, and with it the winter flux. It took the strong as easily as the weak. Antoine sickened on a Sunday, died on a Wednesday before the doctor could even reach the plantation. Zeldina held him through every hour of it, wiping his mouth, singing until her voice cracked, begging whatever gods might listen to trade her life for his. When his breathing stopped, she did not let go. Servants had to pry her fingers away one by one. Leclerc stood in the doorway weeping openly, something no slave on Bellerive had ever seen. They buried Antoine the next day. 7 small graves now marched in a sorrowful line beneath the live oaks, each marked by a simple wooden cross that would rot within a few seasons and leave no trace. Zeldina was 27 years old. She had borne 7 children and buried every one before any had seen a 5th birthday. Her body was thin, her breasts, empty breasts, bound flat with strips of linen. Her hair, once her glory, hung lank and uneven from the night she had hacked it off. The mirror showed a woman with hollow cheeks and eyes that looked 100 years old. She moved through the big house like smoke, touching nothing, eating barely enough to stay alive. Leclerc watched her waist and for the first time understood that beauty could die while the body still walked. He brought physicians again, tonics, quinine, ports shipped from Madeira. Nothing brought color back to her cheeks or light to her eyes. At night she began to walk, barefoot. In her nightgown she slipped from the bedroom and wandered the galleries, the garden, sometimes all the way to the cemetery. Celeste followed once at a distance and saw her kneel between the tiny graves, palms flat on the earth as though trying to reach through soil and wood to the children beneath. She did not weep then. Great silent sobs that shook her whole frame but made no sound. After that Celeste stopped following. Some grief is too private even for those who share the same chains. 7 children, 7 births, 7 deaths, 7 small bodies returned to the ground that had spawned them. And through it all the law stood unmoved, Every child had been born a slave because its mother was a slave. Every child had died a slave. Their father, who had kissed their foreheads and wept over their coffins, could not have freed them, even had he dared try while he lived. The womb that gave them life condemned them to chains before they never had the chance to feel. Zeldina turned 28, then 29. The big house grew quieter. Leclerc drank more, spoke less. Visitors remarked that Belle Reve no longer felt like a home, but like a beautiful tomb. And in the slave quarters, mothers hushed their children with a new cautionary tale, the beautiful woman in the big house who buried her babies one after another, whose grief was so fierce it could curdle milk and wither crops. They crossed themselves when they passed her on the path, afraid her sorrow might be catching 7 graves beneath the oaks, 7 small souls who never knew a day without night coming too soon, and one mother left to carry them all inside her chest, where no grave could ever be deep enough to hold the weight. The morning of the 14th of June, 1845, began like any other along the river, heat already thick at sunrise, cicadas screaming in the oaks, the smell of cane syrup and wood smoke drifting across the fields. Francois Leclerc rose early, shaved with his usual care, dressed in a coat of summer-weight broadcloth despite the temperature, and rode out to inspect the new levee work. He was laughing with the overseer about something trivial when the apoplexy struck. One moment he was upright in the saddle, the next he was sliding sideways, eyes wide with surprise, mouth working soundlessly. By the time the hands reached him, he was already gone. 48 years old, rich, feared, and suddenly nothing more than a heavy corpse in dusty boots. They carried him back to the house on a door taken from its hinges. Zeldina met the procession on the gallery steps. Someone had thrown a shawl over her shoulders, but she was barefoot, hair uncombed, eyes swollen from another night of walking to the children's graves. When she saw Leclerc's face purpled and slack, she did not scream or faint. She simply reached out and closed his eyes with 2 fingers, the way a wife might. Then she turned and walked inside without a word. Celeste followed, afraid for the first time that the girl might finally throw herself into the river. The big house filled quickly with white people who had never set foot there while Leclerc lived. Cousins from Baton Rouge, a half-brother from Mobile, lawyers smelling of ink and ambition. They moved through the rooms like crows, lifting lids, opening drawers, counting silver. Leclerc's body lay in the parlor on a cooling board, candles at head and foot, while the relatives argued over who would inherit what. No one spoke to Zeldina. She was, after all, only another piece of property to be valued. 3 days later, the will was read in the library. The white heirs sat in a half-circle, fans fluttering, faces bright with anticipation. The attorney, a thin man with a voice like dry leaves, unrolled the document and began. Land, money, cotton gin, blooded horses, everything recited in calm legal cadences until he reached the final paragraph. Then his voice faltered. To my beloved companion, Zeldina, sometimes called Zeldina Leclerc, though never legally so, I give and bequeath the sum of $10,000 in gold to be paid immediately upon my death, together with her full and absolute freedom, and the small cottage on the bayou known as Petite Rive, with 20 acres surrounding, to be hers and her heirs forever. A collective intake of breath sharp enough to rattle the chandelier. The half-brother leaped to his feet, face crimson. He was not in his right mind, the cousins hissed agreement. The attorney raised a placating hand and continued reading the codicil that directed the executor to purchase Zeldina's passage to France if she wished, or to any free state, and to provide an additional $500 annually for life. The room erupted. Someone called it the ranting of a lunatic. Someone else muttered "nigger wife" loud enough for every slave waiting outside the windows to hear. That night the heirs locked the library door and burned the will. Not the entire document, only the pages containing the bequest to Zeldina. They left the rest intact, enough to satisfy the court that probate, and swore one another to silence. The attorney was paid handsomely to forget what he had read aloud. By morning, the story had changed. Leclerc had died intestate except for a few minor legacies to white relatives. Everything else, land, slaves, money, would be divided according to Louisiana law. Zeldina learned the truth from Celeste, who had listened at the keyhole. She was sitting on the back steps shelling butter beans, hands moving automatically, when Celeste crouched beside her. "They burned it, child. The part about you. They burned it," and laughed while the paper curled. Zeldina's fingers stilled. A single bean fell to the ground and lay there like a small green heart. She stared at it for a long time, then resumed shelling, faster now, as though speed could outrun grief. The next weeks passed in a haze of appraisal. Every spoon was counted, every horse walked past prospective buyers, every slave lined up in the yard and examined like cattle. Zeldina stood with the house servants, barefoot again, wearing a plain Osnaburg dress that had once belonged to a kitchen maid. The heirs had taken her silks, her pearls, even the little gold thimble Leclerc had given her after Lucien's birth. She was priced at $1,800, prime fancy girl, age 29, proven breeder though children deceased, teeth good, no marks of the whip. The irony was lost on no one in the quarters. Rumors flew along the river. Some said the mobile half-brother wanted to keep her for himself. Others claimed a New Orleans speculator had already offered 2,000 sight unseen. Celeste whispered that a Creole gentleman from the city had come at night, looked Zeldina over by lantern light, and shaken his head sadly, saying she was too thin now, too haunted, not worth the trouble she would bring. In the end, it was a man named Jules Devereux who bought her, a quiet, heavy-set planter from Point Coupé parish whose wife had died the previous winter and who wanted someone to manage his household and warm his bed without the complication of white gossip. He paid $1,900 cash, a price driven up by two Natchez dandies who remembered the girl from the auction block 13 years earlier and wanted her for nostalgia's sake. Devereux simply outweighted them, calm and implacable, until they gave up. The sale took place on the front gallery of Belle Rive, the same spot where Leclerc had once spun Zeldina laughing after Lucien's birth. A portable desk was brought out, papers signed, money counted in rouleaux of gold eagles that clinked like bones. Zeldina stood to one side, hands clasped in front of her, eyes on the middle distance. When Devereux stepped forward and said, "Come, girl," she walked down the steps without looking back. Celeste pressed a small bundle into her hands at the last moment. A square of indigo cloth containing a lock of Etienne's baby hair, the knitted booties that had never been worn, and the tiny silver thimble engraved M that had once belonged to Leclerc's lawful wife. Their fingers brushed. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. The wagon that carried her away was plain, pulled by mules, nothing like the red-wheeled phaeton of her arrival. She sat in the back on a sack of corn, knees drawn up, the bundle in her lap. As Belle Rive receded behind the dust, she finally allowed herself one glance over her shoulder. The house looked smaller than she remembered, almost toy-like beneath the vast sky. The 7 small graves were hidden by the curve of the levee, but she could feel them pulling at her like invisible chains. She pressed the bundle to her chest and faced forward. Point Coupé was 3 days downriver by steamboat, then another day overland. Devereux's plantation, La Belle Étoile, was smaller than Belle Rive, but prosperous. The big house painted a cheerful yellow that seemed to mock the mood inside. His overseer's wife, a pinched woman named Madame Troxler, took one look at Zeldina and announced she would sleep in the Garconnier until other arrangements were made. Those arrangements were made quickly. Within a week, Zeldina was installed in the master bedroom, dressed in mourning black at Devereux's request, her hair combed and oiled again, a new coral necklace around her throat. He was not cruel. He simply expected obedience and silence, and for the most part he received both. She performed her duties with the same distant grace that had once silenced auction crowds. She kept the keys at her waist, ordered meals, directed the house girls, sat at the foot of Devereux's table in the evenings while he talked cotton prices and politics. Guests assumed she was a free woman of color hired as housekeeper. No one asked questions that might embarrass their host. At night she lay beneath him, eyes open, counting the knots in the cypress ceiling the way she once counted cherubs at Belle-Rive. He was heavier than Leclerc, slower, but the act was the same, ownership wearing the mask of affection. Time passed the way river water passes, slow on the surface, treacherous underneath. Zeldina turned 30 in the spring of 1846. There were no more children. Her womb, exhausted by grief and repeated pregnancy, had closed like a fist. Devereux did not seem to mind. He had grown sons in New Orleans and wanted only comfort, not heirs from her body. Some nights he drank too much and wept about his dead wife. Zeldina listened, stroked his hair, murmured the French endearments Leclerc had taught her. In the mornings he thanked her with small gifts, a length of lace, a bottle of cologne, once a tiny porcelain doll that made her recoil so sharply he never offered toys again. She began to walk again, the way she had at Belle-Rive, but now it was along the bayou behind the kitchen garden where cypress knees rose like drowned fingers. She went at twilight, barefoot, humming the lullabies her children had never lived long enough to forget. The house servants watched from windows and crossed themselves. They said she was conjuring or mourning or slowly going mad. Maybe all three. One evening in the autumn of 1847, a peddler arrived with news that travelled faster than his wagon. The burned fragments of Leclerc's true will had surfaced after all. A clerk in Natchez, dying of consumption and eager to unburden his soul, had confessed everything to a priest. Copies of the original document, witnessed and sealed, had been found in Leclerc's strongbox behind a false panel. Lawsuits flew. Heirs screamed fraud. The case dragged through courts for months, but in the end the judge ruled the codicil valid. $10,000 and freedom were Zeldina's retroactively from the day Leclerc's heart stopped. The money arrived in heavy oak boxes escorted by armed guards. Devereux accepted the situation with surprising calm. He had, after all, enjoyed her company for 2 years, at no cost beyond food and clothing. He even offered to let her remain as a free employee. She declined with a politeness that chilled the room. She packed the indigo bundle, the coral necklace she had never liked, and the black dress she had worn since Leclerc's death. They said if you came close, you could hear the voices of children answering from the water. Whether she lived another year or 20, no record remains. The last certain sighting was in 1850, when a Jesuit priest wrote in his diary that a woman, matching Zeldina's description, had paid for 7 masses to be said for the souls of Etienne, Lucien, Marie Zelda, Philippe, Gabriel, Angèle, and Antoine Leclerc, children dead before their time. She left a gold coin on the altar and vanished into the fog before he could ask her name. $10,000 bought her freedom on paper. It did not buy back one heartbeat, one smile, one tomorrow stolen from the 7 small bodies mouldering beneath Mississippi soil, and somewhere, on a quiet bend of the river or in the narrow streets of New Orleans, a woman who had once been the most valuable piece of property in 2 parishes walked on alone, carrying every child she had ever borne inside the cage of her ribs, humming the lullabies they would never outgrow, beautiful still and broken beyond any law's repair. The year 1850 found her in New Orleans, living under the name Madame Zéline Claire, a name she had chosen because it sounded like something a free woman might carry without apology. She rented the 2 rooms above the bakery on Rue des Remparts, rooms so small that when she stretched her arms she could almost touch both walls at once. The bed was narrow, the armoire scarred. The single window looked onto a courtyard where fig trees fought with morning glories for light. It was nothing, and it was everything. No one could enter without her leave. No one could order her to open her legs or close her mouth. For the first time in her life, the key to the door was hers alone. She woke before dawn every morning, the way field hands do, even though her hands would never again hold a hoe. She made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, sat at the tiny table, and wrote names in a cheap ledger she had bought from a stationer on Chartres Street. Etienne, Lucien, Marizelda, Philippe, Gabriel, Angele, Antoine. She wrote them in careful, rounded letters, then traced over them again and again until the paper tore. When the page was ruined, she tore it out, burned it in the small hearth, and began another. Some mornings the baker's wife downstairs thought she was keeping accounts. She let the woman believe it. $10,000 in gold, once the lawyers took their share, had become $7,412 in banknotes and a draft on the Louisiana State Bank. It was more money than most free-colored women saw in a lifetime, yet every coin felt stained. She spent sparingly: rent, bread, coffee, candles, black cloth for dresses she sewed herself. She bought 7 small silver medals from a silversmith in the quarter, each engraved with a single initial and a date of death. She wore them on a ribbon around her neck, hidden beneath her bodice, close to the skin, so the metal warmed like living things. When the ribbon frayed, she replaced it, but the medals never left her body, not for bathing, not for sleeping, not even on the hottest nights when the air lay wet and heavy as a soaking blanket. In the afternoons she walked, always the same route, up Rampart to Congo Square, across to the levee, then down past the markets to the Place d'Armes, and back through the narrow streets behind the cathedral. She walked slowly, head high, eyes taking in everything and nothing. Children playing marbles scattered when they saw her coming. Mothers pulled toddlers closer. Not because she looked dangerous, she looked like sorrow given shape. Old men on balconies tipped their hats out of habit, then remembered she was colored and pretended they had been swatting flies. She noticed none of it. She was listening for small voices on the wind, for the sound of 7 pairs of bare feet running through cotton rows that no longer existed. People began to speak of the woman in black who walked every day at the same hour. Some said she was a Placey whose protector had died and left her comfortable. Others swore she had been the fancy maid of a great planter upriver and now carried a curse that killed any man who touched her. A few recognized, or thought they did, the girl who had once stood on the Natchez block and stopped every heart for 10 full seconds. They told the story in barber shops and cafes, adding flourishes with every telling, until Zeldina became Zelina, Zephyrine, sometimes even Salome, but the core remained. A woman so beautiful she had driven a white man to madness and been punished by God with the death of every child she bore. She heard the stories and never corrected them. Truth was heavier than lies, and she had learned, and she had no strength left to carry anyone else's version of her life. In the evenings, she sat by her window and sewed piecework for a dressmaker on Royal Street. The woman paid her by the finished garment, no questions asked, glad to have hands that could set a sleeve or embroider a monogram better than most French nuns. The work kept her fingers busy and her mind from unraveling entirely. Sometimes, when the pile of finished bodices grew high, she allowed herself one small indulgence, a twist of pralines from the old woman at the corner of St. Philip, or a few cents pressed into a palm so gnarled it looked like driftwood. She ate them slowly, letting the sugar melt on her tongue, remembering how Lucien had once tried to gum a piece and laughed when it stuck to his nose. Once a month she visited the Ursuline chapel on Chartres and paid for 7 candles, 7 of them, always 7. She lit them in a row and knelt until the flames burned low, whispering the names in order, touching each medal through the cloth of her dress. The nuns grew accustomed to her. One young sister, newly arrived from France and still soft-hearted, tried to speak to her after Mass, offering consolation, perhaps absolution. Zeldina looked at her with those calm ancient eyes and said, "Sister, some sins were never mine to confess." After that they left her alone, though they kept a candle burning for her in the sacristy whether she came or not. Years slid past the way the river slid past the levee, silent and unstoppable. 1851, 1852, 1853, the city grew louder, dirtier, richer on the cotton and sugar that her children had never lived to pick. Yellow fever came again in 53 and took thousands. She walked through the streets untouched, as though death recognized one of its own and passed over. Smallpox followed. She nursed strangers in the charity hospital because someone had to hold the hands of dying children, and her own arms had been empty too long. Cholera in 55, again she walked the wards, carrying water, emptying slop buckets, closing eyes that would never open again. The doctors called her an angel of mercy. The dying called her maman, even when they were grown men. She never corrected them either. Her hair, once her glory, had turned the color of midnight frost at the temples. Lines had carved themselves around her mouth and between her brows, yet the bone structure remained. The carriage, the eyes that could still stop conversation when she entered a room. Men still watched her on the street, though now with the wary respect they gave storms or panthers. She ignored them all. There was only one man who had ever truly seen her, and he had taken everything when he died, will or no will. In the spring of 1857, a letter came. The baker's wife brought it up the narrow stairs, curious about the heavy cream paper and the Natchez postmark. Zeldina slit the seal with a dinner knife and read the few lines twice before the words made sense. Celeste was dying. Lung fever, the doctor said. She asked that Zeldina come if she could. There was something she needed to give her before the end. She left the next morning on the steamer City of Natchez, the same boat that had once carried her south, chained below decks. This time she sat in the ladies' cabin, a free woman with a ticket bought in her own name. The river looked smaller than she remembered, tamer, as though time had worn down even its pride. When the boat tied up at Natchez under the hill, she hired a mule and a boy to drive her out the old trace road. The way was overgrown now, the grand plantations showing gaps in their hedges where fences had fallen and not been mended. Belle Reve itself was shuttered, windows blind with dust, the galleries sagging. Cotton grew wild in what had been the front lawn. The 7 graves were gone entirely, ploughed under for a new field, or washed away in some forgotten flood. She stood where she thought they had been, and felt nothing but the familiar hollow ache, like a tongue probing the place where teeth used to be. Celeste lay in a small cabin behind what used to be the overseer's house, lungs rattling with every breath. She was thin as kindling, eyes huge in her sunken face, but the old authority still clung to her. When Zeldina knelt by the pallet, Celeste gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "Took you long enough," she rasped, managing half a smile. Then she gestured to a cedar box under the bed. Inside, wrapped in the same indigo cloth Zeldina had carried away 12 years earlier, were 7 small bundles, a curl of baby hair, a scrap of christening gown, a tiny shoe never worn, a wooden rattle, a silver christening spoon bent almost double, a lock of reddish down that could only have been Antoine's, and 1 perfect camellia bloom pressed flat and brown with age. Celeste had saved something from each child, hidden them all these years, waiting. Zeldina pressed the bundle to her face and wept for the first time since the day they pried Antoine's body from her arms. The tears came soundless, endless, soaking the cloth until the scent of cedar and old grief filled the room. Celeste stroked her hair the way she had that first night at Belle Rive and whispered, "Wasn't your fault, child, none of it." Then she slept, and by morning she was gone. Zeldina buried her beside the cabin under a young pecan tree and paid a stonecutter in Natchez to carve a simple marker, Celeste, faithful unto death. She left the cedar box in the grave with her. Some things were never meant to be carried any farther. She returned to New Orleans lighter by one friend and heavier by every memory the box had held. The city had changed again. Gaslights now lined the banquettes, omnibuses clattered over cobblestones, talk of secession rumbled in the cafes. None of it touched her. She resumed her walks, her sewing, her candles in the chapel. The medals around her neck had worn thin from constant touching. The ribbon had been replaced so many times it was more knot than cloth. In the winter of 1861 the war came. Federal gunboats appeared on the river like iron monsters. Plantations burned. Slaves walked off by the thousands, some with nothing but the clothes on their backs, singing as they went. Zoldina watched from the levee as families passed, mothers with babies tied to their backs, old men carrying bundles on sticks, children wide-eyed and silent. She gave away what little money she had left, blankets, the last of the pralines. When the Union soldiers marched in, she stood on the banquette in her eternal black dress and felt nothing, not even vindication. Freedom declared by cannon and proclamation could not reach into the ground and give breath back to 7 small bodies. The city stank of occupation and victory and defeat all mixed. She nursed the wounded again, blue and grey, indistinguishable under blood and bandages. One night a young Confederate lieutenant died in her arms, whispering for his mother. He could not have been more than 17. She closed his eyes and thought, "Another child who will never come to me in dreams." After the war, everything was different, and nothing was. The bakery became a boarding house for Yankee officers. She moved to a smaller room in the Faubourg Marigny where the rent was cheaper and the ghosts quieter. She was 43 years old, though the mirror told a lie and said 60. Her hands were knotted now, the medals around her neck polished to a soft glow from 30 years against her skin. She still walked, though slower, leaning on a stick of wild olive wood a carpenter had carved for her. Children no longer ran from her, they ran to her, calling her Mademoiselle Zéline, begging the stories she sometimes told in the courtyard at twilight, stories of 7 little spirits who lived in the stars and watched over mothers who had to walk the earth alone. In the spring of 1870, a fever settled in her chest and refused to leave. She knew the taste of it, the same taste that had taken Celeste, that had taken half the children in the city more than once. She paid the rent 3 months in advance, bought 7 tall candles, and laid herself down on the narrow bed to wait. The landlady found her 3 days later, hands crossed over the medals, face calm, almost smiling. On the table lay the ledger open to the last page. She had written the 7 names one final time, and beneath them, in letters suddenly strong and sure, they waited for me. "I am coming." They buried her in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 in a plot paid for by the Ursuline nuns who had never stopped lighting candles in her name. The stone was simple, the kind paupers received, but someone, perhaps one of the children who had loved her stories, carved 7 tiny camellia blossoms along the edge. No one knew her true surname, so they wrote Madame Zéline Claire, 1816 to 1870, requiescat in pace. Years later, old men on the levee still spoke of a woman in black who walked the moonlit streets singing in a language no one understood. They said if you followed the sound, you would come to the river's edge and see 7 small lights dancing on the water, waiting for their mother to finish one last song. And sometimes, when the fog rose thick and the city slept, rivermen swore they heard a voice, low and sweet, carrying across the dark water. "Sleep, my babies, sleep. Maman is here. The chains are broken. The night is kind. Sleep." 7 lights flickered, brighter for a moment, then winked out one by one, as though someone had finally gathered them close. And the river, patient as ever, carried the sound downstream, past the old plantations, past the bones of Belle Rive, past every place where a beautiful slave girl once paid for her beauty with every drop of her heart's blood, until the song became part of the wind itself, and no one could tell where sorrow ended and mercy began.